So I'm Paul Maltby, and I'm Director of Public Services at a company called Faculty, which is the UK's leading applied AI company, so come and hire us. I guess why I'm really here is for 20 years or so, I've worked in government reform teams at MHCLG, at GDS, Home Office, local government and elsewhere, working on data and digital reform as well as some strategic policy reform. And it's just an absolute pleasure to be here with basically my data heroes from public services. So I'm very pleased to be in this panel. We're going to get going on this really great topic of how do we go from strategy to implementation. It's one of those old topics. It will never go out of fashion because it's blooming hard. So it's a real delight to do that in the context of thinking about the government's agenda on data. But we'll come back to that in a moment. First, let's just introduce the panel quickly, if we don't mind. So to my right, Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Downey. I'm the service owner for the planning data platform at MHCLG.
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a senior partner at TPX, where I've worked with various areas of central gov, so MHCLG, CDDO, DCMS, MOJ. And before that, I worked at British Red Cross for 5 years, where I was head of innovation and head of GIS and information management.
Hello, I'm Heather. I'm currently head of the tax gap analysis team in HMRC. I'm taking a break from data leadership roles to actually work in some data at the moment, which I'm really enjoying. But previous to that, I led from data strategy to implementation at Valuation Office Agency and at MHCLG. And I'm about to start a new role in HMRC as Deputy Director for Benefits and Cross-Government Analysis, which is bringing the data together to give great policy advice from cross-government sources.
That sounds much cooler than me. Hi all, I'm Charles. I'm the Chief Data Architect at ONS. My teams are responsible for data design and infrastructure, so putting the data in front of analysts across ONS and thinking about ways we get the interesting data in front of people like Heather to make cool analysis with.
Hello, I'm Anna Powell-Smith. I run the Centre for Public Data. We are a non-partisan non-profit that helps civil society get access to data. And before that, I was Chief Product Officer at Flourish, a data viz startup.
Great stuff. So a lot of folks with experience of wrangling data from different perspectives and making it do things that add value. So this question of going from strategy to impact, it feels like it's a great time to talk about that. So obviously we've got a government that's just on a bit of a roll in terms of talking about data and talking about digital at the moment. We've had, just in the last few weeks, we've had the digital blueprint, we've had Matt Clifford's AI Opportunities Action Plan, and a host of really interesting documents around that. And it really feels like that feels like an injection of energy, and certainly from my perspective, some really useful, the good stuff that you want to see talked about, but perhaps a bit of a gap between that and on the ground people still doing things yet. So we're about to go into a spending review and all the rest of it, so no doubt some of that will come through. So this question, I think as Paul said the other day, sorry to steal your line already, Paul, but basically it's time for government not to fluff this, right? It really, really matters. I think a second area that I'd really like to get into in the panel today is this thing of, we know this sort of valley of death between a prototype and implementation. And certainly working in AI around public services, we see this smattering of really interesting, quick prototypes, particularly in generative AI, people calling the API, getting some really interesting things off the ground. But we know there's some hard graft that has to go on between that and actually shipping a thing that people use day to day and can rely on and use and really add value in reality. And I think that experience that a number of us have had of seeing plans and ideas and people struggling to get going and struggling to take things into delivery, I'd really like to explore that part today. In fact, and then the sort of third thing I was going to say was around data access. And I think one of the areas that we see like this really intriguing, no doubt many of you too, is around this proposal for a national data library. And again, this question of sharing and access to data within government, but actually further afield as well, feels like a really pertinent point. Plenty of examples across government and some people, again, on this panel today that have been doing this for some time and struggling with the practicalities of that. And I'd really like to explore that session in our short period today. So I'm going to start off, I think, in the questions around that last point around data access. And Anna, I want to turn to you first, if that's okay, because I think often within those of us talking about public services, we tend to look quite internally within government and think about it team to team or department to department. But actually this question of adding value to data that stretches beyond the boundaries of government, I think is just a really important place to anchor this conversation. So, Anna, can you tell us a bit more about your experience of accessing government data, what you'd like to see, and what could come next?
Thank you. Well, I know this is a practical panel, so I want to propose a practical solution. So one thing we often find when working with people who want access to data is we can make FOI requests or we can ask for stats, but it's very hard to understand the underlying databases, what's in them, what they look like, what the schemas are, what's collected, what's not collected. And so we'll often FOI for the schemas, and that tends to panic people. And we get very variable responses. Sometimes people are happy with that. Sometimes we get refusals. And in some cases, departments have already published data schemes and documentation. That's really helpful. But there's no consistency. It's very time consuming. So a simple, practical thing that I'd like to see is the ICO or possibly CDDO publishing guidance saying, in most cases, it's totally fine to publish your schemas, and if you're asked, you should do so. And there's no, Cabinet Office guidance, there's no security issues around that unless it's a fraud detection database or in rare cases. I think that would be helpful because it would really increase legibility of the data. It would get at a lot of the problem case of the National Data Library around findability, where people struggle to find data, but in a less burdensome way than actively publishing catalogues. And it would be inexpensive and straightforward. And I think if we did that and said, if asked, please publish, that would make it a lot easier for other organisations to then reuse it, for other departments to see what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Jess, you've seen that, I guess, from a couple of places, both on the inside of government, but now I guess also, as a supplier into government and working in those departments that you do. What's it look and feel like when you've got good data access in place?
That's a good question. We've actually been having loads of great chats on the National Data Library table. Not a shout out to that table, but it's been a really great place for conversations. And particularly when we're thinking about designing new services, my experience has been great. I work with a policy advisor. They're really passionate about gathering data to inform their decisions. But actually, we also need to think about, great data capture, but also data access. Actually, at the time, some decisions we've made is we're going to spend the first year and a half actually collecting the data, making sure it's the right data, making sure it's got great data quality before we actually start providing access, just in terms of prioritising designing services. And I've done that with MHCLG and HMLR. But I think, we've been having great chats around who is the data for at the end of the day, particularly when we think about the data library. Is it for corporates? Is it for internal civil servants? Is it for the general public? Like, who is the user of the data and what do they need it for? And that always should inform the design of what we do and what we need.
So you can always say, what's user need? A question asked too little perhaps in data circles, but resonates with some of us, Paul, can we say old timers? Can we allowed to say that? So you're building services around data for users in MHCLG. What's been your experience?
On the planning data platform, which I've got you to thank, Paul, for existing, really, you gave us the space to experiment. And we sort of basically started off working with policy teams and in the department, and the ones which we had the most inroads in were in the planning area. And we started to sort of pattern match. We met lots of planning policy teams who independently decided that somehow data standards was the answer, to the question they had, which was like, how do we get data available at a national scale? Planning has devolved to lots of smaller organisations, local planning authorities, which is local planning authorities, which is local authorities, councils, but also national parks and development corporations, which are coming back into vogue. So you had to go to a lot of places, a lot of websites to find the same information, like, data standards is the answer. But really that's an externality on those sort of organisations. Say, give me a list of all your conservation areas. Well, say, why should I do that? We've already got it, and we do planning in this area. And when you explain you want that data available nationally, so people can use that to build, different services and change how people experience the planning system, that just came at a cost and a risk to them, and they didn't see the value of it. So lots of the work we did sort of after sort of coming up with this idea was to actually try and work with companies who could work at a local authority scale. And so they could immediately get value from that, from making that data available much more quickly than having to wait a year to get the data available nationally. So that kind of, giving people who are doing the work the value and trying to do that as quickly as possible and at a small scale and build up was the main thing we learned to start with.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think already even in this brief conversation, we're thinking about this from two ends, right? We're thinking about this from the catalogue, from the schemas, from what is actually available, but then also back into the service, into the users, actually making, as it says here, about making impact quickly, which is, I think, something that is really hard to do. Now, Charles, you've been also at the front line of this in government for some years, actually battling away, trying to get the data that's usable, that's available across different government boundaries. How do you see it?
For some years, that makes me sound tireder than I am, although I'm quite tired.
Doing God's work.
So they keep saying. It is really hard, right? So I think one of the problems, and actually we've alluded to it two ways here. Well, one of the things is, as Anna rightly said, if we just publish schemas, that would take away the overhead of having a catalogue. But actually, in my experience, the real problem with having a catalogue is that no one wants to share their schemas. So getting people to in some ways, that guidance might need to look. This is what we tried to do with the data marketplace when I was at CDDO. Was try to give people some risk assurance about what a well-defined schema looks like, and how you can then map that to data standards. So I'm probably one of the people that Paul's talking about. I always think the answer is data standards, right, to anything. But it's not necessarily. I think when we tend to talk about this in a way of of pushing it onto people. Like, here are some data standards, you must now use them. It's going to cost you X million pounds to retool your legacy systems. And the only times when I've seen us make progress is by saying, here are some standards that you can map to, tell us what you're using, and we'll develop a bridge for you. Mm-hmm. So I think there's the kind of, we need to know where we want to be, which is we want to have a good view of the data estate across government, but we need to build to that slowly.
And there's something in this, so now I'm no longer a civil servant. I guess in theory I can say what I want, but there's working in data for a long time in government, there's a fear sometimes where the data owners and curators are worried about someone's going to go rifling around in their data and realise it's not as perfect as they probably think it should be, or they've told someone that it might be, or someone expects them to do it. And I think that gap between that thing around friction of how do you reduce the fear, how do you reduce the friction that's required for folks to access it is a really important part of it. Data is actually quite a human enterprise in public services as well. Heather, can we come to you? Again, you've just been there in different places at the gnarly end of big departments struggling with data, probably within the organisation as much as anything. What does that look and feel like, even when you share a lot with your colleagues trying to work and access things?
Yeah, I think a lot of this stepping back and thinking about the role of government in it is essentially a market failure. So where you don't have data standards in place, there's a muddle. And working through that muddle is really difficult, and all the different actors and institutions have different goals, constraints, funding, and so on. But ultimately, is it the role of government, and this is prioritised, to step in, to define some standards if necessary, like in your area, Paul, put legislative teeth behind it?
Yeah. And so I'm tempted to make a bridge into this question of the sort of slightly broader question of this thing of everyone's got a plan, particularly around AI at the moment, and thinking about what that means. And there's a bit of me which is, really nervous that everyone's going to spend their time planning things instead of doing things, right? And that's, we can't just bumble on without thinking about it. We need to think about it properly. But again, I think this experience of like Paul, you said, starting small, iterating, challenging with users, actually seeing this stuff used, not just from the planning work, but from your experience, you've again from GDS and elsewhere, you've seen this. And I think what's the thing that you can guide us in on this journey collectively as we're thinking about data from strategy to impact? Come on, you've been there.
So, Yeah, so I want to come back on the standards, but maybe I'll hold that thought for a minute. But one of the things we sort of so there's lots of ways to slice things up to sort of. It's quite hard to work on land registration, for example, because you can't work on a locality. People move from one end of the country to another. But actually in planning, there's quite a few different ways you can slice things up. So you can work with a local authority or a development corporation. You can work in small areas of the country. But you can also work with the quality as well. So a lot of, in the planning system, there's several phases you go through, and there's some broad brushstroke decisions you make, like where do you target investment, or when you build a local plan, like are we going to go for growth in jobs, or are we going to find places to build houses, or are we going to try and keep this place the way it is? And that conversation with the community can be had with data, which is, statistics being, like, was it good enough for government work? It's sort of it's guessing with style, to be rude to my standards detractor. But when you actually come to further down the line, and you're actually going to work out what can I build on this site, then you need data which is authoritative, has a high authority around it. Because the cost of building somewhere the wrong place is really high. You could tear the building down. So you actually really need those authoritative boundaries, and to go against what Bill was saying this morning, that the data quite often is wrong. Well, actually, sometimes data is the thing. You don't have a passport unless you have a record in the passport database. Your passport is a printout of that record, right? And it's the same with a lot of the sort of data that we deal with in planning decisions. It's a record of the planning decision. It's quite surprising, like how seriously that's treated. A local authority put some test data by mistake into their planning register, had to go to the planning through a planning appeals process to remove that. They couldn't just delete those records. So the data is the thing, and I think that stuff is much harder to get out into into make public. You would think it'd be easier, but it's sometimes harder. So lots of different ways you can slice things, and then the other thing is. Just making the data available and then expecting magic to happen is not enough. You've got to build, a stack, again, to give the people the value of stuff. So you can't just, you've got to have at least one use case in mind when you're making a data set. So often people come and say, wouldn't it be great if we had a national register of this? And you say, well, okay, well, if we did have that, who would use it? What would they do with it? And what do you want to happen as a result? And then you have better conversations around policy as a result. And if you can make something that prototypes that really helps that conversation.
Yeah, and Anna, can I turn to you on that? Because I think, I'm sure many of you know already, but Anna's been responsible for some really amazing, outside of government use of government data sets to make points in campaigns, and just for like, actually these things are interesting. So you're sort of like the amazing expert user of some of the data that folks in this room make available, but probably not the user that they intended or expected. What does it look like from when you're sitting there with the laptop at the other end? What do you need in order to make this stuff work, beyond the schemas, of course?
Well, I mean, you need people who are going to talk to you. So you need to be able to ask somebody what's going on when you've got questions and you want it to be robust. You need someone to talk to. You need schemas, documentation, all of that. You need an interesting policy question as well.
Yeah.
You need a bit of luck. I mean, I think the more you do this, the more you realize you're really talking about databases most of the time, not data sets. And if, in terms of going back to your not fluff it question, I think that's one thing I'd like to see more of, is just a focus on databases, not data sets. If you're going to do that stuff well, you have to know where it's coming from. You have to know why it's being collected. You have to know who collected it, when, what that looked like. And that, I think, often gets neglected in these kind of conversations.
And is it, I mean, I always think there's something in my mind, which may be a sort of false schema of sorts, but it's data from services rather than data for policy via statistical route. So it's almost like there's something here which is it's rooted back into an actual practical use case. And I think, my sort of tuppence worth into this national data library conversation is making sure that we're thinking, many ways, like the data exchange stuff that Charles and others have been working on for some time, is thinking this as a route back into the core data from services, perhaps for other services rather than for one-off pieces of analysis.
I'm going
could be different?
not answer that and answer something else, sorry.
Right.
So I think it's really interesting, the concept of getting access to databases, or it's the eternal struggle in my job between an analyst just wants the raw data. Right? Just give me the database and I can do what I want with it. And they go, sure, but you won't be able to understand it because no one's put any metadata in. But that's a different conversation. We tend to have two approaches to this. One is, how can we make that available as a data set, as everything? But also starting from this idea of curation, and can we go out and speak to users and find out what they need and then produce a data set that addresses that? Yep. And I think we can be a little bit caught between two stools there. That actually, when I think about a catalogue, I think the value of a catalogue is that you can do things that you wouldn't have thought of. Yep. Because you go and, I don't know if it's just fond memories of the Argos catalogue, but you get ideas you wouldn't otherwise have had, right? The more that we provision data products, it pushes analysis, it pushes questions down that very specific route, which we're probably not the right people to answer. I'm certainly not the right person to answer. I have got cleverer people working for me. But I think from that, it would be quite a useful conversation to have and start to have better ways to push that out with users to say, where are the use cases, and when should we be provisioning you something which answers a very specific question versus something which is more unfettered access where you can start to find stuff out. I think that actually quite a lot of data scientists would come down very hard on option 2, right? And then that becomes about, that is why departments and us get quite nervous about it, because the problem with databases is the metadata is awful, almost inevitably. Right?
Yeah, Heather.
We were having some chats about, sorry, I've jumped in. We were having some chats about kind of the operating/costing commercial model of the potential future national data library, actually. And it just reminded me, if I think about like the census, for example, and how they opened up that data, and the amount of my friends and family thought, this is amazing, this is so accessible, it's incredible. They were going down to like hyper-local level, they were loving it. And then you've got other options, such as if you think about TfL data, and that's now being used by Citymapper, et cetera, and then if I told my mum and dad, who love Zoopla and Rightmove to bits, that actually that's public data that comes from HMLR that's gone on to use, I think that there's an interesting thing to think about access to data with the public data library and who accesses it, but also how, and how we build those kind of commercial or like business models around it. And I think that's probably the layer that I'm super interested in thinking about beyond what we've got.
Yeah, just developing some of that. This it's such fascinating, the really long supply chain that there is for data from the early stages and how you kind of start to think about standardizing it to the end user. One way I find really helpful to imagine it is if you think about all the products that are potentially on sale at eBay, Amazon, really, really big warehouse, and then you think about like a bespoke shop that just sells a small range of things that are designed to fit together and be easy and accessible, and you can walk in and it's friendly. And that's the kind of like end of the supply chain that a lot of us are not involved in. But, when that gets better, that will kind of like raise the game of how people understand and interpret this.
And I suppose there's a temptation to think of it almost like as a stack in a way, right? There's a sort of broader web of access and understanding from the schemas, from actually understanding the ways in which the data can and should be exchanged within government and also outside of government where it's appropriate. But I almost think of it as there's nucleation points almost on that web with particular types of use. So say like around planning, just the broad, vaguely there's data available on planning. It's just not enough, both within public services related to planning, but also the emerging prop tech sector and all of those folks, and actually having a curated set of data and users. So some of the work that faculty does with the Department for Education at the moment, looking at an AI content store, because if you think not just right now when you want to fine tune a model for say doing homework or exam marking, the models aren't good enough. You need to actually really fine tune that data with data that isn't commonly available. You can't just go on gov.uk and get that. But also if you're starting to think about this as a world where you've got agentic models that are coming to government expecting a knowledge foundation, which is probably only a few years off, right? And who knows quite what it will look like, then actually just going to gov.uk in the classic sense isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to actually curate some of this more for government. You can't do that for literally everything. So there's almost like there's a mass availability with some certain rules, and then particular points of value that you pick across that web. This is sort of, I suppose, is the picture that I have. I'm not sure if that resonates more broadly, because we are talking about different things, aren't we? Like Heather, you said there's particular points of value within that. Paul, I'm looking at you, hoping you're going to come and out with an amazing metaphor around data that you can kind of help us unpack this.
A metaphor. I might make a bit more work, I think, for me that I've got. But actually, in terms of just data availability, I think the way where we are with AI at the moment is they've not really worried too much about the guardrails of intellectual property. So they're basically, if something's publicly available, it's they can use it. It's available to them. So they've hoovered up the internet. And they've hoovered up all the music and all the films and all the sort of video games, everything you can find, and they've thrown it into this sort of, this thing, and it still can't answer the questions. And the reason is because a lot of things aren't on the internet or aren't digitally available. They're still, like on microfiche, especially in planning, a lot on microfiche or on paper, and they're just not in a way that's consumable. And so so some of the work that we're doing now is like, especially with the spend review and excitement around AI, that is an opportunity. I don't imagine there's a spend review bid in government that doesn't have a line about AI in it, because obviously there's a lot of interest in it, and I think it has got legs. But we can talk about making the raw materials for better AI, and so you can actually ask better questions and get answers. And in planning, it's overwhelming the amount of stuff you have to read. I mean, local plans, there are thousands of documents and they're hundreds of pages long. Nobody can read them all. So, give that to a machine, it makes total sense to do that. And then you can sort of cluster them based on policies. Who's got policies for playgrounds? Who's got policies for, for clean air? That kind of question really has legs. And as Tom was showing earlier, one of the other sort of areas where it's really showing fruit is around is getting data out of documents which are like handwritten or badly scanned or got terrible drawings on them. Camden, their Article 4 directions, a planning thing, the boundaries for them are hand-drawn on hand-drawn maps and shaded with a pencil. And we've been throwing those with working with the incubator. And they've been turning them into, polygons, and then they've been working out, even with hand-drawn maps, how to place those good enough for a planner just to tweak and make into real data. And that kind of thing seems to show a lot of promise as well. And I think the other thing is that we're sort of evolving some principles, which I think probably are quite common, but in planning, planning is not a rules-based decision. Well, there are rules, but mostly it's in the round. There's a planning balance. Like, on the whole, this is a good idea. And so informing planners to make decisions, but by actually making the information digestible, it's a kind of AI territory. So there's lots of promise in there, I think. And then the other thing is one of the big delays in planning is consultation responses. Nothing unites a community more than something they don't like. And so you get a lot of responses, but actually mining those responses and making them make sense is sort of, again, the thing that AI is really good at. And there are companies who've got good businesses based on that we're trying to enable and help government buy their services.
Yeah. Charles?
I was going to say, Paul makes me optimistic about AI, which those of you who know me will know is not a happy place for me. But I think it is worth thinking about it in a couple of ways. So we've had some really good success recently with some AI trials around data architecture tools, which I know there are very few data architects in there, but for those of you who are, they're brilliant. But one of the things that to square the circle here is that we have real problems with standardized data or good metadata, and a lot of the teams of architects I employ spend a lot of incredibly boring time standardizing data, mapping to standards, pulling out schemas, making metadata for data sets to go in. Actually, our proof of concepts with generative AI have really sped that up. What that means is the data that comes out of that is then better to go into a future model training environment. So we start to get into a bit of a virtuous circle. So it's when I think we elide that middle step without the expert in the loop to start with that I get really concerned about things being just LLMs being pointed at government data and then let's accept that as fact. But well-structured data gives you good answers, and actually they can help in the construction of well-structured data.
Well, I give a big here on that because I think it's a funny thing being an AI company that's been around for 10 years at the current moment, because there's a bit of hype, it turns out, going on, which is a blessing and a curse. But like my plea in a way is to think less about the cheesy chatbot to the public. I mean, you can do that, it's fine. We'll very happily supply you with one of those. But I think there's an awful lot of just the grind of work and charge. That example, I think, is a really good one. Paul, you also for earlier as well. It's just, there's a lot of hard work being done by hand that actually, in a relatively constrained way, we've got machines that can do that stuff to force multiply everything. We're about to finish the panel. So last couple of comments, perhaps from Jess and from Heather, if you don't mind, just to kind of finish us off, and I think then we'll be good to go. So Heather, do you want to bring it to a close and your last sort of, sorry, with Jess as well. But
So I was watching an old episode of The Thick of It last week. I think it was from 2009, and it was the one where they lost the data stick. And it really struck me, even though things are hard and it's hard to get change to happen, just how far we'd come since then. The language around gender and workplace behaviour, it was, a bit extreme, but around data in particular really struck me. We've made massive progress. Thank you.
Oh, we've got two. I was going to go back on the AI point, actually. I was just going to say, thanks. There's just so many use cases. I just don't even know where to start. Guidance, we've even talked about it in terms of speeding up, discovery alpha beta. If you can spin up a prototype in 3 hours now, a clickable prototype, why are we spending so long on this? So I just think the opportunities are endless, but to your point, Paul, it's actually turning this into action and doing it. And I know that MOJ are making great strides in this, and there are certainly pockets of government that are moving ahead and actually doing the doing, and that's incredible. But it's just, if they are doing the doing, how do we then take those examples and case studies and show them to other areas of government so we can kind of accelerate their progress? So,
yeah, well said. That's a really nice place for us to finish on. I think that's my plea to you, which is, I know you all are doers anyway, but this is a point around data, particularly around AI actually, which is past the point of just planning and vague possibilities, but getting into that space of actually delivering practical value, bringing the teams along with us and doing sensible things. This is the time to actually match with that government ambition, I think. But doing it safely and doing it sensibly is a plea, I think, on behalf of all the public as well. Thanks, it's been a great panel. What an honour to be chairing these folks, and thank you for inviting us all along today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day.